Good evening, Clarice.
I own a motel not too far from here, and you'd be welcome to spend the night in one of the empty rooms if you'd like.
It burns! Oh, it burns! And I'm the devil.
Little Mikey Myers that lived across the street. And that's when the voice came. The night he murdered his sister. It told him to kill his family.
Michael Myers. Someone, anyone, help me. Dr. Loomis, are you out there? Can you hear me, Dr. Loomis? I need your... Michael Myers.
What the hell is going on?
Hello and welcome to the Necronomicast. My name is Wayne.
This is Brian.
This is Doug.
And tonight we have just a star-studded interview with Mr. Daniel Farrands. He is a writer, a producer, a director, all things horror. If you like Amityville, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween.
Everything. Yeah.
This
Amityville.
This interview is for you.
So let's do it without any further ado.
Do it.
Our interview with Daniel Farrands right here on the Necronomicast.
You know, it's always fun for us on the Necronomicast to open up our discussions of horror movies and the genre in general to those that are in the industry. And so we're very excited to have a conversation tonight with Mr. Daniel Farrands. Daniel is a writer, producer, director. He's a man that knows a lot about the industry, and he's done a lot of great projects. So we're excited to have him on the show. Calling us from the City of Angels, Los Angeles, California, Mr. Dan Farrands. How are you, sir?
Good, guys. Thanks for having me on.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for being here, yeah.
Thank you. Well, what we always do when we have somebody new on the Necronomicast show is talk to them and kind of maybe break the ice by having them talk about what got them interested in horror in the first place. Maybe you can trace a little bit back your childhood and tell us what got you interested about horror and how it became your career and vocation.
Well, probably being a kind of messed up Catholic started that whole thing. Certainly fallen from that tree. But I guess I have to really. This is kind of a funny story, and it's reared its head again like this past week, so it's kind of fresh in my mind. In 1981, my mother had gone out of town. We were definitely not allowed to see movies like this for fear of the devil and things like that.
Oh, yeah.
So we had a babysitter, and she was high school age, and I demanded that she take us to go see Friday the 13th Part 2.
Yes.
And she did, reluctantly. It was under the threat of, if you ever tell your mother I took you to see this, you'll regret it. So,
Yeah.
Beautiful.
But she did, and it traumatized me completely because this was something I'd never experienced in my life up to that point. And interestingly, after I got over the utter abject fear of the whole idea of it, I wanted to figure out how they did it. And that sort of unleashed this inner thing in my adolescence where everything that I did as a junior high school student was, geared toward making movies that were in the ilk of Friday the 13th and Halloween's and all the things that were so popular at that time. And, and remember, this was at the beginning of all these franchises where we didn't know there were going to be 12, 13 parts to them.
Absolutely.
At that point, they were really forbidden, verboten kind of things that you just, you kind of was like the thing you dared each other to go see.
Yes.
So, there was something really genuinely scary about these movies back then. And so I became more and more fascinated by the idea of how do they do that? How do I, it's like, I guess I always liken it to people who love roller coasters. You either love them or you don't. But it's almost like you want to, once you've had that thrill, you want to keep re-experiencing it. And that's kind of what it became for me. And so my whole adolescence, I will have to say, was spent, making knockoffs of these kinds of movies. And that somehow turned into a career that's now lasted about 20 years.
Oh, yeah.
So
and that was a great decade to get inspired by horror movies. I mean, the 80s
well, we didn't know
were
that at the
so
time.
great.
We thought we were tempting fate. We thought we were going to hell. We thought, this was also in the days before. I mean, VHS was sort of there, but kind of just in its infancy. So you could go to these little mom and pop video stores, and they would have all these obscure things. And I grew up in a small town in Northern California, Santa Rosa, California.
Oh, did you?
And there was no, we didn't have access. There wasn't, and of course there was no internet. We didn't have the direct access like now. It's just, there's almost like, too much for what's going on out there.
Right.
I would save my allowance and run down to the corner, newsstand and look for this very, very, like, forbidden magazine called Fangoria. To see what the latest was from the terror teletype. So that just became my world. My whole passion was truly these movies.
Yeah, it's funny because I grew up in Santa Maria, California.
Cool.
Which is right by Santa Barbara, San Luis area. And, the same thing. Fangoria magazine was my gateway because I was so terrified of Friday the 13th, Part 1, that I wanted to know how they did it at that point.
I hadn't seen Part 1, but I didn't really need to because they kind of showed the whole movie in the first 10 minutes of Part 2, so I knew what was going on.
That's a great story. I cut my teeth on Part 3, and we had Cox Cable was brand new in Omaha in 1983, and so my parents were older and they went to bed early, and I would sneak down and I would watch Friday the 13th Part 3, but only like 10 or 15 minutes at a time, and I'd be so scared I have to go back up to bed and then like shake under the covers, and then like I saw it's going to be on 2 nights from now at 2 in the morning, so I go down and watch another 15 minutes of it, and
oh my god,
it was a great time, man. It was a great time to grow up.
One of those like scrambled HBO boxes, and it was like a little tiny, like a little box, and then you'd have to kind of like jiggle it a bit. And I'd like take the box off and put it in the TV where nobody could see it, so I could watch these. They'd repeat Halloween 2 on HBO back then, and anything that was horror, I absorbed it. That was the language of film that spoke to me most.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
And although I had grown up a huge Star Wars geek like the rest of us and all of that, I think for some reason I really became more geared toward the horror genre, and I was just so taken in by it that it was just something that I really wanted to do from that time on.
Did you ever think about getting into the effects end, or were you always about I want to be a filmmaker? Or both?
Writing was always my thing. I was always writing scripts, even in junior high, even younger than that. I mean, I think I was writing scripts when I was like 7, 8 years old.
Wow.
Just banging these things out, and I taught myself how to type. And in those days, we didn't have computers. I was using like a little typewriter. And but then the whole thing really came to a head. I mean, I go back to the Friday the 13th thing, but a couple of years later, I just decided. I think I was 14, and I decided that it's time to make my mark into the big time. So
at 14, I love it.
I'm going to spend my summer vacation, and I'm going to write. This is after Part 3 of Friday the 13th. I'm going to write the next sequel, and I'm going to explain to these people how this needs to go down. And I did that, and I wrote a letter to Frank Mancuso Jr., the producer of the series, who was all of maybe 25 years old at the time, making these films. His father was the president of Paramount Pictures. But so I sent this letter off, and whatever I wrote in the letter clearly made an impact because Frank wrote back to me. And he wrote me this incredible letter of encouragement. He certainly didn't want to buy my script, but but the great thing about the letter was where he said, we are currently in production with the final chapter, and the series will come to an end. So I still, to this day, kind of hold that letter up to him and laugh. But but the fact that this guy from Hollywood recognized me and acknowledged me in some way just made the difference. I think that was the moment where I was like, oh, wow, holy shit, I can actually do this.
Right. And
it was just like the light switch immediately went on. And from that point forward, it was just, that's what I was going to do. So
that's incredible.
Careful what you wish for. But, the funny thing is that Frank, to this day, we remain friends. He is incredibly generous. He gave his very first interview on camera ever about Friday the 13th for me a couple of years ago when we did Crystal Lake Memories, the documentary on the series. And it's just something that he hasn't really gone public with over the years, and he's really moved on from the whole franchise. And although I don't think he's necessarily embarrassed of it, I think it's a time in his life he just has moved on from a long time ago. But as a favor to me, he stepped up and he did the interview, and it was, I think, one of the coolest things in that show.
That was that short film you did, right? I was at the
yeah, the short one. That's 7 hours short.
Nice. So
that's
fast,
a little bit of how it all, the craziness began.
So fast forward, you're writing studio executives, and then all of a sudden, you are writing. Now, I don't know if it's your first thing that you did, but you wrote an installment, number 6, of Halloween. How'd that come about?
I did. Oh boy. Well, in a similar way to the whole thing with Frank Mancuso, I started. Yeah, so basically, so I lived in Santa Rosa. I grew up there. And kind of out of high school, I just decided, well, if I'm going to make these movies, Frank and all these people live in L.A., so I need to be there. So I basically moved here out of high school and did a couple of semesters of college, but it wasn't really for me. And I just really started writing scripts, and I'd already written a few, and banging on doors and sort of going, hey, I'm this guy, and I know all about these movies, and somebody should listen to me.
Trying to get that street cred is hard, I would imagine.
I guess. Yeah. I don't know. Maybe there was just a weird, I guess when you're that young, you don't have that sort of thing going on where you're like, that's not how that's done. You don't really know any better. So I think I was sort of guileless, and I just sort of went with my instincts. And I wrote scripts that maybe were great, but were enough to get people's interest. I had my first agent when I was 18. Amazing. And they started kind of showing me around town and introducing me to people, and I sold the treatment to TriStar at a young age, and worked different jobs. I started as in making my living as a writer at that time. I worked for, of all things, I worked for the Motion Picture Association for years. The dreaded MPAA, the censor.
Yeah.
So another irony of my whole life is that I worked for the censor board, or among those people, for many years. And so when my gory movies later came out, I think in a weird way they kind of turned a blind eye to all that because well, it's just him.
Right. Yeah, Dan's good people.
But so there's no bias there. But so it just started in a weird way, And anyway, but circling back to your question, with Halloween, so I had written a letter to Mustafa Akkad. And it got to a guy named Ramsey Thomas who was producing stuff for him at the time. And this is shortly after the 5th Halloween came out. So we're around 89-ish at this point. And the 5th one had come out, and I had this, again, kind of like when I saw the Friday, it's like, oh, okay, there's this guy in a black hat, and he knows something, and he's part of this whole thing. And so I instantly had this concept of what this should be. And kind of like I did with Frank all those years before, a few years before at that point. I just wrote this letter saying, I get this, you got to meet with me. And weirdly enough, I got a call, and it was from Ramsey saying, we are going to be interviewing writers for 6, and we're going to make that movie right away, and we were interested in what you had to say. And by the way, send me a script, send me something you've written. So I sent him one of my Friday the 13th scripts, and I think something else I'd written at the time. Whatever I'd written was good enough to get me in that door. And I had my audience with Mustafa Akkad, and I was nervous as hell. I think I was 19 at the time, 20 maybe. And walking in the door, the Halloween posters are on the walls, and you feel like you walk to the principal's office in a way. And I sat down, and I kind of pitched my little heart out for, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes. And then it was like, thank you. That was it. And dead silence for about 4.5 years after that.
Wow, really?
And what I had come to learn was that the whole series had gone into a whole series of just legal discussions and not necessarily, I don't know if the lawsuits were the result, but I think it was kind of a battle for the rights of Halloween.
Right.
And I think John Carpenter got involved, and Deborah Hill got involved, and all the other producing partners that were involved in the series were kind of all vying to get control of it at that point.
So during this time,
it took years to untangle it. And ultimately what happened was Miramax, which was a brand new company, well, fairly new, I mean, they weren't the Oscar winners they are now, had come in and wanted to buy up all of these titles, and they bought Halloween. And so when that happened, I was like, well, that's over. I'm not going to get anything. I'll never hear about this again.
Mm-hmm.
And out of the blue, one, I don't know, May afternoon, so it's 20 years ago, I got a call from Mustava's office saying he wants to meet with you.
Wow.
And I went in, and he basically said with his producing partner Paul Freeman, who was there at the time, and his son Malik, they said, look, we've gone through 6 other writers. Nobody knows what to do with this. We remembered you, and in fact, we still have all of the notes you left us all those years ago, and we use this as kind of our Bible of Halloween, because you seem to have the whole history of this down better than anybody we've ever known.
Wow.
I had made this notebook with like the whole history of the franchise and every character in like a family tree, and this slight overkill for a first time pitch, but
hey,
it was enough for them to go.
Hey man, you stuck in the crawl for 4
I think what they
years.
saw was like the passion, that I had for the series, and that was it. That was the beginning. Was that meeting? And they had a timeline. They had to start shooting that October. This was already May, so that shows you how much of a rush it was to production. So I was hired by May or June and spent the summer, and off we went. They say that overnight success, but it really took years.
Yep. Really, and it really took them, for them to sit on it for 4 years. But it's amazing that they kept everything. You must have made quite the impression. So now
something, I don't to this day I couldn't tell you what, but I think Mustafa Todd was, and God rest his soul, he was a gentle soul and a really kind man and a strong businessman. You wouldn't probably want to cross swords with the guy because he was tough. But to me, it was like having your uncle, your nice uncle, call you up and offer you a job.
Yeah, absolutely.
He was very nurturing, and he really protected the talent, and he really. That whole time and that whole thing, and Miramax was new, and it was a difficult road with them from the beginning. And and I know you guys have probably heard, and many other people listening have heard the stories of what happened with that movie. But it just became a sort of a political thing, and as often happens when studios get involved, it just mutates into something you didn't intend it to be. But that whole time, Mr. Todd really shielded me from all of that stuff. He never really let those people interfere with what I was trying to do. So, I was always grateful to him.
Nice. So you're an established writer at this point. You've got your, your first major motion picture under your belt as a writer, and then so now you're starting to also jump into co-producing and directing. And how does one make the transition from writer to being a co-producer?
Been on set.
Yeah, guys. I think the answer to that is there's no one way of doing any of that stuff. I mean, God, I have friends in this business who started off as assistants, to celebrities or to producers. Some of them were animators. Some of them were, God, it just runs the gamut. I think a lot of times it's sort of being at the right place at the right time and having something that I was putting quotes, they want. Attaching yourself to valuable properties is important. And I'm not saying that everybody can get their hands on rights to IPs like Friday the 13th or Halloween, or in my case, Amityville horror has been a big part of my life for many years, and there's a whole backstory to that. But I think sometimes having the ability to get to the people who own underlying rights to things is a really good way in, because suddenly, it's not just this guy who I may or may not know or give a shit about, but he happens to have the rights to this amazing thing that we all would love to be a part of.
Nice.
So that's a way. But there's so many ways that people break in and end up doing these jobs, and it varies. 10 different people on your show would probably tell 10 different versions of their story, but my way just happened to be that I had a love and a passion for these franchises, and that love sort of propelled me into other jobs.
Mm-hmm. It's real clear that your love for these genres, for these franchises and the genre, comes forth with these documentaries that you've been a part of.
Oh, yeah.
I really enjoyed His Name Was Jason. And then I saw Never Sleep Again, the Elm Street legacy, all about Freddy Krueger and everything.
That was a good one.
Fantastic.
Oh,
and then the 7-hour plus bonus footage
Yeah.
of Crystal Lake Memories.
Right.
Just when I thought, I really enjoyed it, I was like, finally, somebody's giving Friday the 13th some due with this.
Yeah.
His name is Jason. Boom! Like almost 11,
Right.
11 hours. How do you start to develop? I mean, I know there's a lot of material to work with, but these documentaries are so groundbreaking and they're wonderful.
Thanks.
How do those? What's the genesis of those?
Gosh, well, with Crystal Lake, I mean, that all goes back to my fortuitous meeting with Peter Racky, who, for all intents and purposes, is like my clone. We are like born of the same, DNA somewhere because our stories are so similar as far as our upbringing and our love for that series and everything else. So the fact that, in fact, we were introduced by Larry Zerner,
really?
Shelley in part 3.
Yeah, he's been a guest on our
Out
show
of
as
all
well.
of this stuff was born. My even my own representation is Friday the 13th alumni. Larry has been my good friend and an entertainment lawyer. He became a lawyer in his later life or his current life.
Larry's actually been a guest on the show. He's on.
Has he?
Yeah, I think a couple years ago we talked to him.
He's such a fun guy, and he's really just such a big, part of my life. I can't overstate my appreciation and friendship with Larry and how much that means. But he, he was the guy who said, there's this guy who I met who's wants to do this book called, on Friday the 13th, Crystal Lake Memories. And long story short, I don't know if I can get there, but Peter and I met, and out of that connection grew that book, and which I'm assuming you guys have heard of or seen.
Doug and I both have copies of it.
And also we interviewed. What was her?
Just
Adrian
a labor of
King.
love on every level. I mean, I can't again overstate the fact that what a born out of passion project that was. We had no publisher. We had basically no money except for our own. Jeff Garrett, who is our kind of unsung third partner on that project, put his money into it, and Jeff worked for Sean Cunningham at the time, just, kind of as his office guy, and development person. And Pete and I, had this connection, and Pete had done all the legwork for this. He had interviewed dozens of people at that point, and that process went on and on and on and on and on, and then on some more for, I don't know, a couple of years. And little by little, this book was being built out of his passion for it, and me just sort of being there to kind of plow the field in a way, and making, all the other things happen for him, and editing the whole thing and going through line by line. But he did an amazing thing with that, and nobody could see what he was doing. And in fact, when we launched the book in 2005, I think it was, and we had this huge thing up at Universal Studios. It was a big gathering of everybody from the series that was able to come. But there were at least 100 people from the movies that came that night. And Sean, and we had a big thing, and Jason came out and cut a cake with his machete, and it was quite a big to do. But I think when people saw that book for the first time, their mouths hit the floor because they couldn't believe that a movie or a franchise like Friday the 13th was being treated like, Lord of the Rings or Star Wars or something that they would have this kind of keepsake, this kind of, treasure of a book.
Not only is it gorgeous to look at, with all the behind the scenes photos and all the artwork and everything, but the interviews themselves, I mean, a lot of those people don't pull punches. I mean, they tell how they talk about, they really talk about what it was like to make a film away from the eyes of unions and things like that. And so it's a great read. It's a great book. And the documentaries that you've been a part of too. How does it get involved with also like Nightmare on Elm Street? Because in my head, I'm thinking about, especially with Friday the 13th, you got Cunningham, Georgetown Pictures, you've got Paramount, New Line Cinema. Now you've got Platinum Dunes, and all these people, with their hands in the puzzle or hands in the pie, and it's a puzzle to kind of put it together, and with rights, and I mean, there's clips from all the movies. I mean, logistically, it must have been a nightmare to kind of put together.
It was. Nightmare doesn't begin to cover it, guys, and I think here's the thing, like we certainly learned a lot from His Name Was Jason, which for what it was fine. But for me, it never really was what I intended to make. Look, Peter and I had labored, and I give full credit to Peter, but we certainly were in the trenches together 90% of the time on that book. And we all had a lot at risk when that book was done because we didn't know if anybody would buy it. We had put all of our own money and our own savings and our own time and energy into it, and we were kind of like, God, we were hoping we'd sell like maybe 1,000 copies. And we had no idea, that it would still be sold after all these years, and it's still being published, and it's incredible to us. So anyway, it was, and again, but though that being said, I think we felt like, okay, it's a risk, but it was a fairly smart one when you put a title like Friday the 13th on the book. But I think until you see the results of it, you don't understand the power of these franchises, and just what a huge fan base there is out there. When I did Halloween 6, I felt like I was in a vacuum. I felt like that kid that grew up and nobody really understood what I loved and why I loved these. And I thought I was the only one, in a way, which is silly to think. But from a kid's perspective, you sort of think, I guess you don't think the dollars and cents of the whole thing. You don't realize the fact they're making these movies, somebody's making a lot of money off of them. And I guess I just never thought in those terms until the book came out, and suddenly it's the hot commodity and it's getting these great reviews. So, but cutting to a couple of years after that, and an opportunity arose for me and a couple of other partners, one of whom was Tommy Hudson, who's been my loyal producing partner and friend for several years, for us to all get together and do something about Friday the 13th. So the remake was being, I think, talked about at that point, and there was just an opportunity to do something. And so we jumped on it, and little did I know at the time that they wanted something that was not going to quite work, not going to be quite the compendium that we created with the book. And I guess because I had come off the book and how comprehensive it all was, the whole thing ended up becoming, really just with a bit of a sour taste in my mouth, to be honest. When we were kind of like seeing that all of this great material, and I'd interviewed, I think, about 80 people on camera for that show, and just seeing these interviews being whittled down to like little 2-second bites. And I'm like, this isn't the story of Friday the 13th. This isn't what what I want to make.
It was a highlight reel or something.
So that show came out, and it's fine. I think for what it is, it's fine. But it just, for me, never really spoke to my passion and knowledge, I guess, and my, my understanding of what we really had in our hands, because we had all of that stuff. All of the interviews that we had shot were extensive, and there was tons of stuff that didn't make it. So, like, a couple of years after that, I was like, and I talked to Peter, and I started, talking about other things, and I said, what if we did, something about Friday the 13th? And this, by the way, was on the heels of us having a very successful run with the Nightmare on Elm Street documentary, which in itself is a whole other thing, guys, because that's the one that, talk about cutting your teeth on something where you really just didn't know what you were in for. I mean, I don't think any of us, had we known that we were going to end up making a 4-hour show, would have even attempted it.
Really?
Because you got to understand, we were doing this with, similar to the book, like no money, no support. Nobody understood what the hell we were trying to do or why. This was basically made like in a garage. And we're like little toy makers in somebody's garage, like putting something together, and nobody understood what the fuck we were doing, but we seemed to know. And even if we didn't know, we just were on the ride, and we're like, well, we got to keep going. We got to finish this.
Yeah, we have all these interviews in the can. Let's put it out.
Yeah, and it just was. It was like it was trial by fire, but like being thrown right into the center of the fire pit. Like this, there was no. It was like do or die time. There was nothing to fall back on if we didn't do something with this or figure out what we were doing. I mean, I don't think at that point even some of the guys in the show even knew, like the technical side, even knew how to, key a green screen. So like they were learning as they went along on a lot of that stuff.
So do you pull somebody like Heather Langenkamp in as a narrator after you've already kind of got some of it in the can, or how did you hook her to be the narrator?
Well, I have to defer to Tommy Hudson. Tommy is, well known in the Nightmare on Elm Street universe. And in fact, he and Heather have been personal friends for, I think, going on 20 years. Oh, so when I approached Tommy, who we had come off of his name was Jason thing, and we were both kind of like, it wasn't as good as we'd hoped, and what else could we do? And and then Andrew Cash, who had also worked as a co-editor on that show, came in and he goes, Nightmare on Elm Street, really, because he was the big Freddy fan of the group, and not that I wasn't, but he was really like the uber fan. And he said to me, we should really do something with this. And then I approached Tommy, and he and I had a lunch, and I said, what would you think? Do you think Heather might want to do something with it? He said, I'll talk to her. I'm not sure if she would, but we tested the waters, and we said, would you come in and shoot this little teaser trailer for us, and let's just see what people say. And we shot this over like a weekend, and suddenly everybody's like, ooh, that's cool.
Yeah.
So that started the process of all of those interviews that we shot back to back to back to back for weeks and months, and then just the editing of it was insane. It was, sometimes we felt like we were living inside of a Nightmare on Elm Street movie because we were so tired and half asleep half the time, and we didn't know reality from what we were doing. And I remember going to the grocery store one night after coming out of like 18 hours of editing that show and seeing a world around me, and it all looked like zombies to me. It was the strangest thing I'd ever experienced. I felt like we were living in a horror movie.
That'll do
but it all
it.
Turned out great, and the fact that people loved it, and it just made it all, the pain of the whole thing, worthwhile, I think.
The end result. I mean, the movie was, the documentary, even though it was 4 hours, was so comprehensive and had, I think, something for everybody. And I think that's it. No matter what, how much of a Nightmare fan you are, that it had the behind the scenes stuff. It had some great stuff about the effects and all that. I mean, that was just part of my favorite part, but it was a really comprehensive documentary that was just it was fan. You just don't get that, and as horror fans, sometimes that's what we want to do. Just like as a kid, if we don't ever go into the FX or the directing or the writing of horror, well, you get into a podcast about horror, or you watch documentaries.
We want, and here's the thing: like, we wanted to do something like, because everybody remembers. I don't know, you guys probably remember, like, they had put out that box set on DVD several years before our show, and it was like this maze you had to navigate just to look at the bonus features, and half of them you couldn't find anyway.
Right.
And we were like, God, Nightmare on Elm Street is like the coolest, most inventive, creative horror franchise I think ever made in some respects, and nothing's ever been done that brings it all together, at least that you can even navigate. So, and then there was that whole notion of, at the time, similar with the remake of Friday the 13th, then, the same group of people were going on and they remade Nightmare on Elm Street, and we kind of all had just being the fans that we were, especially Andrew and Tommy, like, all had this sort of collective thing about that, like, God, they're going to blow this thing. They're going to fuck it up. Yeah. So let's at least give people, the fans that, like, we all were and the generation that we're from, let's give us one last hurrah on what that was and what it meant to all of us, so that we at least pay tribute to the original series. And that's why we did it.
Yeah, because your documentary, it does play like a victory lap of the original movies, and it's heartfelt. Good. And for a fan, and as a fan, just a guy that watches movies, I really enjoyed it because it made me feel like I learned something new that I hadn't seen before. And I've been watching these movies since the 80s. Now I'm not asking you for any insider secrets or anything like that, but that particular franchise is kind of stalled out. Have you heard any rumblings? Do you think they'll ever redo, or not redo? I hate that word, but maybe kind of revitalize, do something?
Pick it up again.
Yeah.
Here's the thing, guys. Let's face facts. Yes, of course, Freddy's not dead, never will be dead.
Right.
They're gonna do something with it eventually. I don't think there's any immediate plan, not that I've heard of.
Well, they just had the reboot a few years back.
Right, and I think people are now, given the response to that movie and the negative, kind of backlash to the whole thing, I think they're trying to let that kind of wash that away, let it die, let people forget about that, and then they'll find some other way.
The Batman and Robin effect before they came out with Batman Begins.
I wouldn't compare them like that. I liked the reboot.
But here's the thing, these characters are not only so popular, but look, to these studios, these are mountains of money to the people who own them. So they're not stupid. They know what they have. They just, I think, are going to wait for the right time. I know there's been another Friday the 13th film in the works for the past couple of years. I don't think they've yet figured out what that's going to be or when it's going to come out. And they keep saying next year, and then they say next year. But I do think like that reboot, I think they want to kind of let that one die away, let people sort of forget that and figure out a new way in. I think that's the case with all of these franchises, whether it's a horror franchise or a Marvel adaptation or whatever it is. Maybe Howard the Duck will rear his head again one day. Who knows?
Hey, why not? Hey, that kind of brings us to it, and I know that you can't talk a lot about it, but when you're talking about letting kind of things go and then bringing them back, now you're a co-writer and a co-producer on the upcoming Amityville: The Awakening film, and earlier in our interview tonight, you said that you really enjoyed the Amityville franchise. What brought you at least to the point of working on an Amityville film?
Well, it's so funny how my life kind of like goes from, kind of being the guy that, how do I explain, that kind of like tells the inside story of what that real, the true story of it all. And this actually harkens back to my very first foray into ever attempting to make a documentary in my life. Had no clue what I was doing at that point. This is, a few years after Halloween 6. I was working on a couple of other things, still writing. And a friend of mine, my best friend, in fact, said to me, would you spend the night in the Amityville house? And I said, fuck no.
You mean the real house, the house?
The real house,
oh,
yeah.
Wow.
And I had seen the movies and I had read the book. It's funny, as a kid, and you guys are kind of around the same age, so do you remember this thing called the Scholastic Book Club?
Oh, hell yeah.
Magazine?
Oh, yeah.
That they would pass around the playground or whatever, and you'd pick out what book you wanted for $1, and they'd bring it to school, and you'd buy books. Well, one of the offerings in the Scholastic Book Club was the Amityville Horror.
Were you like elementary school?
How a fourth grader was suitable for fourth grade reading, I don't know, but it was on the list of things, and I bought it, and I read it on the playground in, I think, fourth grade, and I pissed myself. And then there was the whole, there was all of the talk, and this was all leading up to the movie back in '79 about the true story and this family and this really happened, and there were these murders, and to me, and being like I told you guys, this sort of like Catholic kid, that was the most horrifying thing ever. It was the devil in Long Island. This could happen to you. Don't turn your back because he's going to come get you.
The devil's coming.
Get out. All of that shit. So terrified, absolutely terrified. So, anyway, cut to whatever, 20-some-odd years later, I have this conversation with a best friend, and suddenly, of course, now I go, oh, that's an interesting idea. Maybe I should find the people that lived in that house. And I did. And not only did I find them, but I convinced them to speak about it for the first time in 25 years.
Yeah.
And
that's a rare thing.
Yeah. And believe me when I tell you, the Lusses did not seek the publicity of this thing. In fact, they had, all of them, they had divorced at the time, but had remained on good terms. Yet, this was a chapter of their lives, let me tell you, that was not a pleasant one. And it was one that I don't think that it took a lot of consideration, let's put it this way, for them to agree to go on camera again. I said, this is a 25-year thing. I think people would really like to hear your story. You've been accused of a whole lot of things. And you could even, back then, could go on the internet and read it. It was a hoax, and they made it up for money, and yada, 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 all this. So, but I wanted to hear from them. I didn't know if it was a hoax. I didn't know anything about these people, other than there was this fascinating story of what they said had happened. So that was the beginning of my association with Amityville, and it was after I interviewed them, and I think I had them on camera for 4 or 5 hours. And we whittled that down to a 2-hour show. And I interviewed everybody, from everybody who said it was a hoax, and a lawyer for the guy who had killed his family in the house, the DeFeo lawyer, a guy named William Weber, and Laura DiDio, who was a young reporter at the time, who I think was very credible and told the story the way it was. But and the Warrens, who are now famous because of their portrayal in The Conjuring. So every cast, a bit of the cast of characters of Amityville, I was able to get them on camera. And we did this special for the History Channel, and that aired, and it was off of the reaction to that George West came to me and said, there's never really been a movie that's really kind of tapped into what it was, and I think you could do it. And so what I didn't know at the time was he had signed a pretty smart deal for himself, although a convoluted one, with regard to the film rights and sequel rights. And so he kind of, over the years before he passed away, entrusted me with those rights. And out of that became now this film that we've just made. And hopefully it will be released later in the year, but I don't have the exact date yet. But the film is done and in the can, and we're excited to see what kind of response it gets.
Nice, because we checked out the trailer, and it looks fresh. It looks exciting, and we're definitely going to review it and talk about it. And we'll have an Amityville show, I'm sure, and we'll be real excited to see that come out.
Yeah, I think they, again, it's funny, talk about everything going full circle. I did Halloween 6 for Dimension Films, and now here we are back doing Amityville with these guys. And, I think they really wanted to take this in a different direction. I think when we originally pitched this to Jason Blum, who's like horror meister guy now, and his name is on everything. Jason got excited about this notion of doing it, not so much exactly found footage, but more along the lines of kind of like a real period movie. We wanted it to look like real home movies that were shot at the house. This is kind of go back and explore the real story, the way it really happened. And then, the found footage thing fell out of favor. And then it mutated into this version of it, which I still think is a really cool version. But I think it would have been interesting to see what that might have been.
Right.
But I guess, I'm curious to see what people's responses to the movie. I think we have some good performances. We have Jennifer Jason Leigh, who's amazing.
Yes.
And she actually was just cast in Quentin Tarantino's new movie.
Really?
She's playing the lead in The Hateful Eight.
She's in The Hateful Eight. Exciting.
Yeah. So, so it's great to have her associated with our movie, and the fact that I think, obviously with a lot of people who make their, I hate to call them comebacks, but in a way, Tarantino's the master of
bringing them
taking
back.
those once very familiar faces and bringing them back. So he's doing that for Jennifer. Yeah, so I think it's exciting. I'm curious to see how it all plays out.
Nice.
You got anything else on the horizon that you can maybe tease us with? Are you writing the next Nightmare movie? Are you writing the next...
No, actually, I have something original that I wrote. This is funny for me. I co-wrote a movie called Havenhurst, which is really scary and it's really cool. It just actually got bought by Lionsgate, so it'll be coming out later this year.
What's the name of that again? What's the name?
It's called Havenhurst.
Havenhurst.
Nice.
Mm-hmm. And it's about the very scary goings-on in a very old, forgotten New York apartment building and the strange people that live there.
That sounds incredible.
Sounds good.
So we got even more to look forward to.
Yeah, I guess. So that's going to be coming out later in the year, and what else? And then obviously a couple years ago we did Haunting in Connecticut, also with Lionsgate. So I was excited when they picked up this movie to work with them again.
Awesome.
I think they did a great job of marketing that.
So maybe Havenhurst will turn into the next big franchise, and somebody will be doing a 12-hour documentary on Daniel Farrands and his movies.
If somebody's going to do a documentary on my thing, it could be somebody else. It's funny, we get asked all the time, and I'm not kidding you, like weekly, maybe daily sometimes I get emails from fans around the world saying, when are you going to do that documentary on Halloween? And I just feel like that would be almost like incestuous. Like, I don't think that I would be the objective person to tell the story of the Halloween series. But on top of that, now that Scream Factory did such a beautiful job on their 15-disc, special edition of the whole franchise, and that alternate cut of 6, which we've been begging to release for all these years, finally made its way out in a legitimate release. So I don't know how much more there's to say.
Right.
There were so many bonus features on that set, of which I was part of some of them. I mean, I did some of the things for 6. I don't know which way we would go with it if we were to do something with Halloween. And I feel like I don't know that I'd be the right guy to do it. I think it might come across as being me being biased in some way. I wouldn't want that ever, cloud people's perceptions of what the show is.
Well, it sounds like the future is certainly bright. It sounds like it's going to be a big year for you. And thanks for dropping that info about Havenhurst. I'm totally excited about that, and we'll definitely be...
Oh, thanks. Yeah, that's exciting for us, too. And Mark Berg, the producer of the Saw films, was executive producer of this project.
Excellent.
So it's pretty violent, gory stuff.
We like that.
It was fun to do, and it stars Julie Benz from Dexter.
Sweet.
Great.
Wow.
And we have Fanula Flanagan, and she was great. She was the you guys would probably remember her. You'd know her by if you saw her. You know her name probably. She's a great character actor.
Mm-hmm.
She was in The Others. She was the maid in The Others that sort of tormented Nicole Kidman of the three. She was the older sort of spinster lady who was one of the ghosts. Not that I'm giving anything away.
No,
but,
spoiler alert! Oh my god, no.
No, but that's
she plays the kind of sinister landlady of the building.
That's a nice teaser to get us excited for what's coming up in the darkened theater. Now, everybody, Daniel, we want to thank you very much for your time and for being on our show. When we were talking about having you on the show, we were just like, man, this guy's done so much, and how are we gonna do this? Are we gonna have to do a 6-hour interview? But you've been
right, guys, help you all. I hope I tried to sum up as much as I could for you. With what time we had here, but it was fun, and it's always great to talk to people who love the genre as much as I do.
Well, you got fans here, my man, and we will broadcast this out to the other fans of yours out there in the world of the internet. And everybody, we had the pleasure to talk to Daniel Farrands, writer, producer, just horror man extraordinaire. And so thanks for your time. And we will definitely keep an eye on your future projects, and we will certainly talk about them in the future here on the Necronomicast.
Hey, thanks, Daniel.
Thank you guys so much. It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Necronomicast, a weekly podcast produced by Wayne Brecky, part of the Free Life Media Network. For show notes and other information, go to necronomicast.com.
So today on the show, Daniel... No, wait. You say it.
Hello, everybody.
All right. Let's try. Working on now. So let's get right into it. Our interview with Daniel Farrands. No, our interview with...
Let's do this again.